Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I don't think it's good morning, or it is good morning for our presenters still for just a little while longer. But good morning, good afternoon. Thanks for joining us here today for the Project Success webinar on how to create a campus culture of care. We have a couple of minutes until 1 p.m. Central Time when we go live. So hang tight. We'll be back here soon and we'll go live in just a few moments. In the meantime, if you have any questions or you're having issues with connecting to audio or you want to ask us something in the chat, feel free to go ahead and send me a message either to all the panelists or to me directly. But it is so great to see so many familiar names popping up here. Hello. Yes, we are excited too. We're so happy to have you all here. Okay, so I will be here and on mute, and our guest speakers are here as well. So we'll allow just a few more moments for other participants to join in live. Okay, so it's 1 o'clock and we have quite a number of attendees who have joined in live. So we're going to go ahead and kick it off with introductions and get started. So officially welcome, good morning, good afternoon. It's so great to have you all here. I hope that you and your families and your loved ones and your campus communities are safe during this time. It has been, I think to use the word unprecedented is just not fair anymore, but it has been a challenging time for many of us, for those of us who are serving students on the front lines, or whether you're virtual at home trying to connect with your students on Zoom or Teams. My heart goes out to you. I know it's been challenging. So I hope that you're staying healthy, you're staying safe, and that you're taking care of yourself as well. I also wanted to say for our Hispanic serving institutions who are here on the call today, this is the week where we are celebrating National Hispanic Serving Institutions. So congrats. We're so happy to have you here as a part of our community, and we hope that you have an opportunity to celebrate the work that you and your campus communities do. And you know, if there is anything that we can help support you all with through the Project Success community, whether that be for our HSIs or our HBCUs, you know, any campaigns, we have the FAFSA opening up. So anything that, you know, you have in mind that you'd like to chat about, feel free to send me a message during this webinar or find me after the webinar and I'll get you connected to the right people on our team. So with that, I want to just hand it over to our guest speakers today to introduce themselves. With so much happening in our campus communities, whether we're virtual or in person, we know that providing a campus culture of care where we put our students first as people who have needs, who may be struggling with the pandemic or other things that are happening in their lives, we wanted to offer an opportunity to chat about what does it mean to put the student first? What does it mean to create a campus culture where students they feel welcome, they feel that they can share their challenges and struggles, but that also we as practitioners are armed and informed with the strategies and tools that we need to be able to better serve our students. I know working on the front lines in student affairs, I had my first job in career services and then I went to enrollment management. I know that often we don't think about, am I ready? Am I equipped with what I need to support my students, to serve my students? And that's exactly what our presenters will talk about today. And one more thing that I'd like to quickly add is that if you have any questions throughout our webinar, feel free to send them in the chat or in the Q&A throughout. I know that when I wait till the very end, I forget my questions. So feel free to chat them to us throughout. We'll try to get them. This webinar is being recorded. So once we're done and it is ready, I will send a link out to everyone to share. And I think those are all the housekeeping things. Oh, one last thing. Yes, we have a survey after the webinar. So once you exit out of the webinar, a web page will pop up. It will automatically take you to a survey. It is 5 short questions. I promise it will not take more than just a couple of minutes. If you could take the time to give us feedback, that would be really great. Okay, so with that, I am going to introduce our guest speakers. I'll first introduce Dr. Jimmy Howard. And then Ritu Roy. They are from the University of Oregon. And if you know anything about what's happening on the West Coast right now, they are seeing a number of issues with the fires and the weather and the climate. And so I'm very thankful for them for joining us today, despite the weather conditions there. They'll introduce themselves, and then we'll share the slide deck, and then we'll get started. So Dr. Howard, I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us. My name is Dr. Jimmy Howard, Assistant Dean of Students at the University of Oregon. And so my main roles there, and hopefully what I can contribute, is building a structure and coordinated care efforts on our campus to make sure that we have wraparound support for our students, but also making sure that that care is culturally humble, making sure that we think about the ways in which we provide services, who we serve, and how we serve. And that each student comes to us with multiple identities. And so I'm hopeful to share a little bit of that today. And I'll hand it over to Ritu.
Hi everyone, my name is Ritu Roy, she, hers pronouns, and I am the Assistant Director of Sexual Violence Prevention and Education. I'm also a confidential advocate for the university, which means that I primarily work with students experiencing any issues of Title IX. So that is anything under the umbrella of sexual assault, dating, domestic violence, stalking, and gender-based harassment or bullying. I also work with students in supporting them during their crises as defined by the student. And Jimmy and I will go more into that during this presentation. So I will turn it back to you.
Yeah.
Give me just a moment. I will pull up the PowerPoint. And here we go. Okay, thank you both. I'll be here if you need anything.
Thank you so much. So, we know that the time we have today isn't enough time for us to go really in depth with some of the things that we're going to talk about. So on the front end, we want to say we have a lot of outcomes and we put a lot of information into the slides that hopefully can be helpful for you later on as you review the slide deck. And for many of you, this also might be things that you know or things that you already practice. And so this might be a time for us, again, to reimagine or rethink or remind ourselves of the ways that we can show up for students. So again, I won't read these outcomes to you directly, but really today we're going to go over how we can create a community of care. We're going to share with you some trends that we've seen about student mental health and distress, particularly for those students who are on the margins. And then we're going to go into a little bit about how we do best practices using our trauma-informed and intersectional lens. And then towards the end, we will talk about your roles, if we have time, the boundaries that you should create, and also ways that your role can better support students. So next slide. Ritu and I wanted to share a little bit about our roles, right? So we define ourselves as student advocates. We are there to help students engage and navigate the university system, particularly when things go awry. And so we, as student advocates, in our program, we define ourselves as anti-racist, anti-oppressive. We practice trauma-informed care. We are empowerment focused, so trying to make sure that students are empowered to make the best choices for them. We engage in continued professional development to better understand our field, best practices, and we also engage in reflexive activities, which means that we're thinking about how our worldview might impact how we're supporting students. So we want to make sure that we're doing work to make sure we mitigate the fact that our own perspectives might be impacting how we're supporting a student. And then when it comes to crisis intervention, we see ourselves as people who are culturally humble. We don't assume to know everything about a student's culture. So when a student sits in front of us, we are very focused on making sure we allow them to tell us their story. We are safety focused. Again, we prioritize student choice. We are collaborative with the student. We believe our services that we provide and everyone should provide should be universally accessible. We provide competent services like making sure that our practice is always up to date, making sure we're always aligned with current policy, practice, and laws within our state and federal levels. We also provide private and confidential services where appropriate. And then we also, I think the final role that we play with our students is just to make sure that they feel like they're respected, have dignity, and that we have compassion for them and their stories. So again, that's a little bit about our roles and how we see ourselves and what we bring to you today. So next slide. So as we sort of set the groundwork, we want to talk a little bit about some of our values and frameworks so that we have a sense of how all of this kind of plays together and the things that are floating around on the surface for us. And the first piece that we will talk about is a little bit about our mission, right, as the University of Oregon. So again, as the Assistant Dean of Students, I actually oversee our Prevention and Response Unit, which is responsible for prevention, support services, and also our crisis response, like I mentioned earlier. We have written a particular statement that, again, allows us to work within to better serve our students, and so that we're consistent on how we do that. So again, we believe that we center our care and student autonomy in our efforts to reduce harm from general crisis, trauma, gender-based violence, substance abuse, and other forms of violence. And we educate the community through an intersectional feminist praxis and help students to navigate our institutional systems and encourage their resilience. So again, this is our message that we've created to, again, keep us on our toes, to make sure that we're always living up to this mission. And I think that's really important as we transition into the next slides that Ritu will talk about as we sort of figure out, again, what actually does that look like in practice, and what does that look like in terms of our values and ethics? So I'm going to hand it over to Ritu to talk about the next slides.
Thank you. So we wanted to start with some foundations around how we view trauma and trauma-informed care. In the interest of time, I might not be reading the full pieces here, but we do have these slides and notes for you for later. So at its base, trauma is an emotional response to a terrible event. And there are physiological, psychological impacts to trauma, as well as a potential shift in engagement around our social context, which we will circle back to at the end around self-care and support in context of the socio-ecological model. Next slide, please. And so I do want to note that the way that we are looking at trauma spans from individual level to collective trauma. And this is important, especially because there has been a lot of recent research around the biopsychosocial impact in our genetic coding. For example, Yusuf et al.'s 2018 study shows that trauma literally changes our DNA that is subsequently passed along into the next generations. So this biologically inherited generational trauma has been studied to have sustained discriminatory impacts across race, gender, poverty, in violent incidents such as war, as well as the other listed examples. Next slide, please. So I really want to note here that oppression is trauma. And I do love this quote because what it really talks about from a practitioner lens is that trauma hinders us from developing into our full potential, both as individuals and as an identity-based group, and thus as a society where these inequities continue to deepen and become the status quo, because we haven't addressed the root trauma piece of oppression. And I think this is important to consider around what does that mean as when we're thinking about student success? Because often the metrics of success determined by our institutions aren't inherently created for our students of marginalized identities to succeed. And we'll circle back to this during our trends piece around how are our students on the margins doing. Next slide, please. So this is just a quick definition around what race-based or racial trauma means. And so how does that show up for our Black, Indigenous, and people of color? Next slide, please. So I really want to end on this idea of shifting from trauma-informed care to really a healing-centered approach. And so here, I want to point out some things that we try to incorporate in our office as the values that Jimmy mentioned earlier, which is going back again to that individual to collective trauma lens. We are holistically thinking through how cultural spirituality, civic action, and collective healing can occur. And we will talk through more of that later. So I will pass it. So next slide, please. I will pass it on to Jimmy.
Yeah. So we know that this time is particularly difficult for our students on the margin. they are dealing with a number of situations. So I gave a speech recently to some marginalized students, particularly in the LGBTQ IA plus group, about the fact that we're going through an epidemic with a virus that's really threatening, our ways of being. But that many of our students on the margins are already dealing with this pandemic on top of the pandemic of racism, sexism, sexual violence, and as Ritu said, oppression. And so a lot of our students on the margin are doubly impacted by having their lives sort of, again, changed on a dime based on our response to COVID-19. And that's particularly showed up this spring, also a little bit this summer, and again, as folks try to figure out what fall looks like. We're lucky enough that we get to sit back and watch some of our other universities open and take some notes. But again, this is not an easy time for folks. They've lost income. Folks have gotten sick in their families. People are worried about healthcare. And so we have a number of issues kind of facing our marginalized students. So we want to spend a couple of slides just talking about some of the general data that's out there that we've been able to pull together for you. And so the first slide is from the Healthy Minds Network. And so this is a national survey that they usually do about mental health and well-being, but they turned it into a COVID-19 study just because there was a number of concerns that popped up that impact well-being. And so again, basically this data tells us what we kind of already know. It's kind of like we know students are stressed out because of their financial situations, but this says that 2/3 of students report that they're stressed out because of their finances. About 1/3 reports their living situation has changed during the pandemic. Part of my work right now is working with students who are in crisis and who need emergency funding, and a lot of them are housing insecure. So either moving from house to house or not sure if they'll be able to pay their rent for the current month. And again, in some states, there has been a moratorium on evictions, but a lot of people are holding balances that might come back to haunt them. And so we're really trying to figure out ways that we can keep our students housed and safe, but we know that the finances are a really big part of that. And then 40% report witnessing some race-based discrimination, either online and in person. And this is particularly for our Asian and Pacific Islander students. They've reported a significant increase in personal attacks on their well-being, both in public and also online. And so again, we know that racial tensions are still bubbling under the surface around some of this pandemic work. And then again, 60% of the students indicate that the pandemic has made it more difficult to access healthcare, particularly mental health care. And that's both, clinical and also crisis support. And so we know that our pandemic has created some isolation, and that is particularly difficult for folks who are already struggling with mental health concerns. And so next slide. And so on this slide, there was a study done at the University of Oregon that kind of investigated how our Black, Indigenous, and students of colors were dealing with the pandemic. And again, like I mentioned before, our Asian students felt less, concerned about their intellectual and social fitting in the university, but were more anxious about, again, the negative stereotypes that are facing them. And again, they're a little bit less satisfied during the pandemic than they felt the prior year. So again, we see that impact there. Our Black students feel more self-assured. However, this study kind of has a lot of different metrics. And so we are assuming that students who are our Black students might actually be a little bit more resilient than some of our other students on campus. And so that might be leading to some of their feelings of being self-assured in their decisions and their work and their general well-being. Our multiracial, multi-ethnic students report feeling a little less healthy and more anxious about confirming some of those negative stereotypes about their identity groups. And then there's some notable, there's no notable difference based on our data between how our Latinx students and white students are feeling in the pandemic. However, based on some of our listening sessions that we've done, we were actually able to pull out some more specific concrete divisions between some of the different groups. And we actually see that our Latinx students are particularly interested in how housing has impacted them, being environments that maybe not necessarily conducive to online learning, because they might be living with multiple generations of their family in one home, and shared internet. And so, yeah, so take this with a grain of salt and know that there are, this is preliminary, and we also have some other context there as well. So I'm going to hand it over to Ritu to share some of our other slides.
Thank you so much, Jimmy. And something to what you said I wanted to note is that the study was done around spring term of May. And so since May, we've been able to understand and see how the shifting experience of our students is impacting them now. And another piece I want to note, primarily because I also share those identities, is that we could not find current relevant data isolating what international student experiences are feeling, let alone documented students, which in itself is othering and marginalizing. And so within the context of how our LGBTQIA+ students are experiencing the pandemic, excuse me. Firstly, I really want to highlight that these statistics mentioned here is an increase from the already established amounts of discrimination these students are facing, which means especially for the statistics around 44% hid their LGBTQ+ identity more often, 30% heard their family members and caregivers make negative comments about queer identity more often, and 36% were cautious about their actions around heterosexual or straight people more often. And so what this means is that for quite a few of our queer students, they're having to go back in the closet or minimize their queer identity for safety reasons, which has a direct correlation to elevated risks of emotional distress and suicide. And within the notes, I also have a study from the Trevor Project, which looks at how what the current trends are for our youth, so not just college students. And very quickly, I also want to note that 32% of our trans and gender diverse students are reported disrespect of their gender identities more often. 37% experience an increase in white LGBTQ people saying things that were racist, as well as 43% were having to spend more time educating white queer students or white queer students, yes, about race. And so, this is also important to note around those intersectional identities of how our BIPOC students are being doubly impacted in their other marginalized identities. Next slide, please. So here, I really wanted to note how our students with disabilities are experiencing the pandemic. And these statistics are pretty alarming at how high the percentage is. And so ranging from 56% all the way to 79% around difficulty accessing services and increase in barriers. And something I want to note is that such high rates when pre-COVID, students were navigating classrooms and campus cultures that already weren't ability inclusive. So during the pandemic, I just want us to consider who are we unintentionally pushing out of our student demographics because they aren't able to stay in school due to these elevated barriers. I also want to note that there have been recent advocacy around the intersectionality of folks with disabilities that aren't often heard as our common narratives. So for example, Black and African American deaf and hard of hearing folks have their own dialect within American Sign Language, which isn't necessarily considered when we are adapting our materials to ASL. So that is another piece to consider, is how are we creating culturally inclusive, accessible material, recognizing that different intersectional student populations might be having more difficulties around accessing culturally inclusive resources for them. And something I also want to note too is that 56% of students, so that's more than half, had difficulty receiving previously approved accommodations, possessing needed equipment and devices to be able to do their academic learning. And also, along with that, 58% had difficulty accessing and receiving academic support and tutoring. And 61% around what Jimmy was mentioning earlier around counseling and mental health services. So next slide, please.
Yeah, so like I said earlier, as we transition into crises and kind of defining crisis in our sort of standard processes for, again, figuring out how do we support students, we know that students are having a really difficult time, particularly those students who are, again, first generation and lower SES backgrounds are having a particularly difficult time during this pandemic. But that does not mean that folks who have resources or are in our upper levels of SES aren't having an impact. And so again, there is isolation connected to this work, connected to this pandemic. And we know that folks are struggling with maintaining their income levels, even if they have the resources available in their families. Because a lot of people, based on what we've seen and what research we've been provided, income levels have changed drastically between fast few years. And so there's this gap in sort of like, well, my family is supposed to be making this much. They're not making that anymore. They're not able to contribute the same way they were. And they're sort of stuck because they can't go back and change some of the context of their student loans or their financial aid. So again, this is a really difficult time for our students because a lot of it is unknown and sort of changing in the moment. So I want to move on to our next slides about our definitions of crisis and how we move through those. Having put forward all those definitions and the context, we think about crisis as defined by the student, right? Defined by the student, and we also recognize that when the student comes to us, they're bringing all of themselves to us at that time. So again, we're not dealing with a person who has a single identity. We're dealing with people who have multiple identities that might be intersecting, right? So again, we might have a black student who identifies as a person who is disabled, who's also on the, who also might be LGBTQIA+. So again, for us, we make sure that every student defines their own crisis, and when they do, that we're considering how they're being impacted by their identities that they bring in front of us. So in terms of crisis, this is a general definition and this is what we work with. So again, crisis for us is an emotional or physical response to something that disrupts their day-to-day normal functioning, right? And so students can come to us lots of different ways. They can be referred to us. We can see something odd or weird happening in their lives, or we can get referred students based on our relationship or our roles on campus. Next slide, please. And then we think about our impact. Again, as Ritu mentioned, when we work with students, we let them define the impact of the crisis, right? So again, the impact on the student based on the situation that occurred is really about the individual's perception of the event. And also, what is that individual's ability to already cope with that, right? So again, we might see the same situation happening between two different students. One student is completely fine. The other student is in a crisis. So again, we don't look at the precipitating event as the definition of what the crisis is. It's how it actually impacts that student. So again, we have to think about this when we're sitting in front of a student who may have failed a test, and we're like, well, it's not the end of the world. But for that student, it might be the first time they're dealing with it. And they also might be letting down their community, letting down their family, worry about the financial impact. So again, we have to think about all of the different spheres of their life coming together during this incident. Next slide, please. So we also have three typical types of crises that we see. One is single exposure, which is pretty identifiable. So again, it's a one-time thing. It can be an accident. It can be the loss of a loved one. It can be a crime. Then we also see cumulative and multiple exposure, which is, again, these are lifetime experiences. This is where I would put racial trauma and oppression. It's something that people have been dealing with their whole lives, right? And likely have built some coping mechanisms. However, even though they might be able to cope with it, the situations in their life, the different identities they bring, might be building up to something that they can't actually maintain or cope or sustain. And then there's deliberative crises that someone is actually doing something to someone to interrupt their day-to-day functioning. And so again, Ritu talked about some of her functions when she's doing her sexual violence work, where someone has harmed another person intentionally. We see this with family abuse. We see this with domestic violence. We see this with acts of bias on our campus, right? Where folks have been harmed deliberately. And so again, that's the kind of crisis that we kind of break that down to. All right, next slide, please. And I always like to tell folks that I talk to about this is that, you know, stress is a part of everybody's life. You know, to be human is to have a crisis and to have stress. However, there are times where we need a little bit of help, right? We might need a little bit of help navigating through that. And I think that's where we come in, right? As folks who are trained and folks who have experienced a little bit of life, can sometimes help with our knowledge, our expertise, our wisdoms, help a student get through that stress in their life, even though it is a day-to-day normal experience. So when we think about our role, next slide, please. We think about our role in three parts, right? So we think about, again, particularly if you work with students in the community, about noticing a behavior or a change. We think about engaging with that student to talk with them, and we'll go a little bit more in detail about this later. And then we think about that active referral to someone who is an expert in helping them figure out what the next steps are in their life. So the first step is notice on the next slide. So when we, as practitioners, notice some signs of distress, we need to do something with that, right? We need to communicate that with the student, or if you're working with a student in a capacity where you know that they're working with someone else on campus, talking to their supervisor to see what's going on. And there's some signs that you might want to be taking into consideration as something that are more serious that you might want to check in if you see. So on the next slide, there are a few of those. So the first is uncharacteristic changes in their academic performance. Things that in their meetings or class attendance, there are some changes into how they're showing up. You might notice some folks are being depressed or lethargic. You know, some people might perceive that as feeling numb. You might see someone who's hyperactive or have really rapid speech. That is a sign, particularly for us, that's really concerning, right? Someone who goes from, you know, pretty, you know, baseline, okay, to someone who's going into this sort of manic state, right? And then social withdrawal is particularly of concern. Folks who have been generally okay and social, and then all of a sudden they sort of fall off the map. Those are some really significant causes of concern. On the next slide, we have some more. So if you notice that people are, you know, dressing different or have a change in hygiene, eating or sleeping routines, it's really important to check in with that student. Repeatedly falling asleep in class if you're teaching them or if you've heard about that. If you've seen some requests for special consideration, that might be a cause for concern. And this is a complicated one. If a behavior that's reoccurring or new pushes the normal limits of what you know that student to be, or again, the norms that you have in your group. Again, this is a very difficult one because it can kind of bend over some territory that that might be not necessarily for concern, but again, this is like people who are more frustrated, are audible, or angry or frustrated at their peers. Things like that that sort of break our decorum of our day-to-day and our effective management of our offices or our classes or our teamwork. That can be a really cause for concern. And then the last one is unusual or exaggerated emotional responses to events. Like I said, we believe that the crisis is defined by the student, but you know, sometimes breaking a pencil in the office, if that leads you to scream or leads to, you know, increased distress, there might be something going on that has a particular impact for that student that's not the situation at hand. So we want to check in. So on the next slide, we want to engage with that student, right? So we want to make sure we have a direct conversation with that student to gather more information. Because like I said, these things on the front end are our perception, the things that we're seeing. We want to check in with that student to see if that's accurate. Like, I've seen this in you, is this accurate? We want to make sure as we're engaging with students that we're actively listening and expressing care and concern so that as we're engaging with the students, they feel more comfortable engaging with us. Next slide, please. So again, like I said, part of our role is to have a direct conversation with our students. And this is sometimes where we need a little bit more development on our own, right? To know that if we see something and say something, we're not going to plant an idea in someone's head, right? We're not going to make the situation worse. Sometimes that student actually might want to have someone interrupt what's going on for them with the conversation. And every student's not going to want to talk to you, and that's fine, that's their right. But again, a lot of students, if you move forward with care, they're going to open up to you. So again, we want to start with the student. We want to set and respect boundaries. So again, Ritu and I like to tell people that we are not clinical in our work, even though we have a staff who is clinical and can counsel. We do not do the counseling, right? So we want to make sure that they know we're not your counselor, but we want to make sure we get you to someone who can help. And so we want to make sure we set clear boundaries. Whatever your campus's policy is on privacy and confidentiality, again, we work at a large public, and so we have some pretty strict bounds around confidentiality and information sharing. We just want to make sure we're upfront with the students on our limitations in order to hold their story confidential. And then the next one is self-care, right? So you might be triggered by what's happening in that student's life based on some of the experiences you've had. And Ritu will talk a little bit more about this if we have time, about how you can sort of do that work to figure out, how am I showing up for the student? Next slide. So here's some goals for the conversation that I always like to tell people, considering some of our frameworks, is one, we got to consider the cultural context of that student. We have to center their reality, because again, when we're thinking about our students and their location at the institution, there's a lot going on that is more than academic, and it's more than just social. There might be things in their worldview or in their family structures that we're not aware of, but that we have to take as real, even if it may not seem huge for us or a big deal for us, it is for that student. We always want to assess for safety. A big one is to care without judgment. There are going to be times where students make decisions that we don't agree with, that don't align with our values, but it is their right as an adult to make the path for themselves, even if it's not the one we would choose for them or has additional consequences that, again, might be negative for the student. But again, that's not our place to judge. It is for them to figure out their path forward. We can tell them, give them advice, but we should be caring without judgment. And then again, the next steps are pretty simple, but again, we want to collaborate with the student on what their priorities are. We want to share information and referrals, and then we want to allow the student to find what success is for them. What do you want to get out of this conversation? What is it that you would like to have happen after our conversation? And then empower that student towards their own self-advocacy. We are not their parents. We are not their handholders. But we are a really important person to them in their lives, right? We're a person that can help direct them to the right location to get the help that they need. And sometimes that's us, and sometimes that's an expert, right? But again, we want to make sure that they are leading and figuring out what is best for them. Next slide, please. So with privacy, like I said, this depends on your institution, but for publics, we let folks know that it's important for us to maintain the privacy with our students. We try to avoid making any sweeping promises of confidentiality, because depending on what the student might share with us, there might be actually some reporting obligations that we have to move forward with a report. And then in circumstances where students are either at risk of harming themselves or another person, it is absolutely necessary to breach that privacy, right? There are a lot of different policies on campuses, but no matter what, if someone threatens to hurt themselves or others, we need to make an immediate referral. So then the next slide talks a little bit about referrals. And so again, this is about being knowledgeable about your institution's policies, practices, and procedures. And so we're trying to make sure that we do a warm, empathetic handoff to these resources that we're trying to refer them to. But again, it requires you to build that relationship, to know what's going on your campus, know your gaps on campus and where you don't have services, where you might have to lean on community services. It's really important. But you need to make sure that you're always advocating to know what's going on and who do I go for, what, and where. So on the next slide, we talk a little bit about when something is referred, what we do with it, right? So we always think about what is the impact for that student, right? So is the student really distressed or just a little bit distressed? What is the level of concern? And I'll go over some metrics that you all can use if you don't already. But what is the level of concern here? How concerned as an institution should we be that this is happening? Again, this is different from the impact on the student. This is, again, a more objective measure. Then we have to think about who needs to know and who we should be pulling into that conversation. And again, this is where that privacy boundary conversation needs to be really important, because you might have to pull in your supervisor, you may have to pull in, again, your dean of students office, your counseling services, et cetera. And then you got to balance your own laws and institutions in your state and at your institution. So again, this all definitely matters about what action happens next after the referral. And so on the next 3 slides, we use a tool to measure what level of concern there is. We use a tool provided by the National Behavior Intervention Team Association, also known as NBITA. We use their risk rubric to look through when a situation comes, every situation that's a little bit outside of the scope of our day-to-day academic problems. We look at this to figure out what is our level of concern and what is it that we should be doing as a benchmark to make sure that we're, 1, doing best by the student, and 2, making sure that as an institution, we're in line with best practices on how to move forward. So again, I won't go into a huge detail because you can find this on the NBITA website, which we'll share following the presentation if you don't already use them. So this is, again, a snapshot of their rubric. So this basically gives you levels of concern, the top being the most concern where we need to get other folks involved. We need to making sure we're moving forward with ultimate concern for safety. The bottom rung where we see the mild cases are things that we can probably do by, again, conversation with you, a peer, a colleague across campus, someone they trust. But again, it all depends on where that student is coming in for you. And again, NBITA can provide training on that as well. And on the next slide, NBITA provides basically a flow chart almost, or a questionnaire that you can actually go through based on the situation you're in to figure out where they place on the rubric. So you start with the simple question to say, are they actively suicidal? You say no, you move to the part of the survey that is next. And basically it's a really objective way to check yourself to make sure that you're providing the best services to that student that you can and making sure that you're aligned with best practices. And again, this document's about 4 pages and it's also free and available on their website, but I would highly suggest you get trained. And then the next slide is suggested interventions. So along with the different sort of scales that you see from NBITA, you're going to see the different suggested interventions for each level that the student is in. And again, you can modify this for your institution. We have some information that we use that, again, is particularly available for the University of Oregon students. But again, this gives us a metric to know that we're providing support that is in line with, again, best practice across all the institutions that are part of this network. And so that's a little bit about that. So on the next slide, we're just going to go through some of our interventions that we use quite often on campus. So care outreaches, referral to university resources, care meetings with an administrator, usually about myself or other deans. And then you can kind of read through the rest of those. But for the sake of time, I'm going to hand it back over to Ritu so that she can talk a little bit about, again, how you set boundaries and balance yourself in the workplace.
Thanks so much, Jimmy. And I think all of that is so important. And kind of adding to that, we wanted to give you some frameworks around how to care for yourself and really thinking about what does it mean to set boundaries and have balance in the workplace, especially for staff that hold identities that have been historically oppressed. So something I want to note here is that going back to that piece of oppression, experiences of trauma lead to feeling powerless. And so I really do believe that the way to reconcile having power as administrators and practitioners with feeling powerless based on our personhood is to center healing for ourselves as well. And part of gaining that power back should be on us to do this personal work of critically conscious self-care, as it will impact how we show up professionally. And in the interest of time, we'll be focusing primarily on quick tips and pointers. And just for y'all to know, the slides do have more details in the notes sections to help you think through what might be relevant for you. So next slide, please. As a base understanding, we did want to note that some definitions around vicarious trauma, compassion fatigue, and burnout, which are all separate symptoms of a potentially interconnected problem. And so you can recognize that parts of your experience are specifically more leaning towards one or a combination. I do also want to make a note here that burnout can be easily resolved. For example, changing jobs can provide immediate relief to someone suffering from job-related burnout, which isn't the case for compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma that need intentional reflection and care to work through. So as a mental health professional, I always recommend therapy for building your coping skills and a response toolkit. And at the very least, especially for vicarious trauma, you need trusted, supportive, non-toxic loved ones and chosen family to help with rebuilding and reframing a more positive or healthier mindset. And so consequently enable you to do the actions that maintain the mindset. Next slide, please. This is just a quick maintaining your ABCs in terms of helping you cope with the above. Next slide, please. So here, I just want to say that the phrase, the personal is political, does come from second wave feminism, specifically the title of an essay by Carol Hainish, though it has most often been championed within Black feminist movements. So this piece is actually something that I've determined as categories based off of my own personal experiences and in conversations with colleagues. Also, just like we've talked about student impact, all of these lead to extra brain power and heightened feelings of insecurity and anxiety, excuse me, which can have us feeling more drained and less productive. And I think this is important to note for staff and faculty of marginalized identities, because this might mean that we're ultimately deemed as less good at our jobs when many of us are already feeling that we are held to higher standards and being representative of our communities. So it can also heighten our sense of imposter syndrome. So around visibility and invisibility, I consider this as the impact of being put in a box because of people's assumptions of you. And in the notes, I talk through some specific examples and prompts for you to be thinking of to both validate your experience that we often don't get to have, and maybe some strategies of how you can address that. So the main themes to ask yourself here is that, do you get a break, or are you constantly being tasked or asked to do extra work for free? And do you feel safe and supported to share or be the multitude of your experiences that you want to bring in your professional self? So allowing for you and your colleagues to have the same level of care and respect that we want to provide to our students in all of the ways Jimmy mentioned earlier. So something that I do want to add in the personal or political especially is that this could add to imposter syndrome and performance anxiety, especially in the nuances of navigating interconnected anger and pain in the workplace. With high workloads and unchanged deadlines, and going back to the piece I shared about burnout, I doubt many of us can afford to lose our jobs, right? For a variety of reasons. And that you are experiencing the same issues and concerns that you're supporting your students and colleagues with, and still having this pressure to hold it together as a response to all of the internalized assumptions we are feeling from the first two, visibility and invisibility, around our identities. And so the last piece I just want to quickly note is the politics in the workplace, because for many of us, we do have to make strategic choices and compromises, which then might feel like institutional betrayal or hypocrisy from others, especially maintaining working relationships with those colleagues who might have viewpoints that counter yours, and really needing to assess what are your non-negotiables. And I really want to note that here, these should be values that can range from faith to personal ethics to political viewpoints. And it should not just be the bare minimum of do no harm, or that this colleague is not doing any intentional harm, but really centering what matters to you and makes you feel valued and supported by others, because you deserve that level of respect and care in the workplace to do your best work. And another piece to note here is that even within our own communities that are engaging in anti-oppressive action, we can feel differently about what the response or the future idea of anti-oppressive support looks like. And so we also need to manage internal politics while also making the external focus around change. Next slide, please. So here I'm not going to spend too much time on this, as it is all in the notes. Is we also want you to think more critically and have more moments of reflection of how you're showing up, even if you have the best of intentions and care about your students. And I want to note that feeling personally beneficial and empowered or good at what you're doing isn't inherently a bad thing, because a part of continuing to do good work is feeling that like feeling motivated to do it because of benefiting from it positively. And a part of doing that good work is to interrogate what our intentions and actions are, that if we are committed to doing anti-oppressive work, which also means not providing and upholding Band-Aid solutions, we ultimately or have to at least partially dismantle the institutions and structures that uphold these systems, including the institutions that employ us to do our work, which is an elevated risk and anxiety inducing. So as to the rest of these, the question prompts, there are sub-question prompts for you in the notes that you can reflect on. And I also want to just quickly note that all of this is based off of my personal professional opinions. And so please feel to add more to it. And this final slide that I want to quickly note is that there's a fantastic worksheet for care practice in the workplace using the socio-ecological model from the Oregon Sexual Assault Task Force. And in the notes, I have links of how to, actually all of the notes have links of how to access these for later. So quickly, I just want to say that self-care practice takes effort, intention, and energy, because you have to essentially continue to constantly self-advocate and practice your boundaries around what you are and are not able to do. And when you're in a place of frustration, disenfranchisement, and hopelessness, that can feel unsurmountable. So again, it goes back to healthy and supportive relationships, which include trusted colleagues and mentors, as well as culturally mindful mental health resources, are essential in being able to take these actions. Again, in the notes, I have much more concrete tips and pointers around how you can do these things at every level. And I just have to refer back to the worksheet from OSATF that is so helpful for you to work through, both for yourself and within your teams. So that's all for me too. And I want to turn it back to Sana, and also Jimmy, if you have any pieces you want to add to what I shared.
Yeah, I think this kind of leans into the Q&A section, but I think we can go ahead and wrap up the presentation. Feel free to contact us. We have a full sheet of resources, toolkits. Please let us know if you need support. We're happy to be a good colleague and chat with you through some of the things we may have talked through today. But that's it for a presentation, but we're open for Q&A, which we already had like 1 or 2 questions that I definitely want to get to.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Dr. Howard and Ritu. I was here taking notes for my own work, and so that was really helpful. I really appreciate you taking the time to walk us through that content. There was a lot to cover, and you all did a really great job in trying to get to all of the important pieces. So if you have to head out, we completely understand. I know that often folks are hopping from one Teams or Zoom meeting to the next. If you could please, before you leave, just take our webinar survey and or jot down the contact information for the presenters if you want to follow up. But we did have a few questions that came up early on in the presentation. We're getting some positive feedback. Thank you. We appreciate that. It's always nice to hear. And the first one was on, could you speak more to your listening sessions and how you structured and maybe marketed those to students? And so if you all want to take that question.
Yeah, so when we started our work on the pandemic, the University of Oregon took it very seriously, right? So we created an incident management team that's basically a structured way that we can assess the crisis. Part of one of the arms of that was a crisis response team. So looking at students' financial resources, looking at their needs for resources. And so I sit on that team. And one of the things we were asking was, what are the students thinking, right? We had heard a lot about what we thought students wanted. We had heard from some students through emails and through different surveys, but we had never really spoken to them. And so part of our conversation was, how do we get students in a room, but also how do we get students in a room so that they feel comfortable talking? And it was really important for me as we were developing the listening sessions. So I helped coordinate it with two other of my colleagues. Is we also wanted to hear from our marginalized folks in a space that was safe for them. So we actually structured it so that we represented all of our general categories that we have for minoritized students on campus. So we had, Black students, we had Indigenous and Native students, we had Asian Pacific Island and DESI students, and we had a lot of different sessions, so 11 in total. 2 were general undergraduate and 1 was graduate focused. And the other were minoritized students. So again, students with disabilities, non-trad students. So again, we had a lot of different sessions. And so we had a general set of questions that we asked each student group, with a question at the end to say, if we haven't touched on, if you haven't touched on it already, how has this culture, how has this impacted you differently than maybe your peers who don't share your communities or identities? And that's how we actually learned a lot of really important information about how our folks who are on the margins were actually impacted by this pandemic. And we learned a lot. And so again, we're still processing through that material, because again, we had 11 sessions that had, I think, about 30 or 31 students in it total. And so again, we got some really good information. But again, it was really important for us to go directly to the students and give our marginalized students space, because we knew that there was something under the surface that they weren't necessarily communicating directly with us. We learned a lot. So I'm happy to share more information about that. I know that wasn't necessarily the focus of this, but again, I think the important part is that we had to make space for our students of color and our other marginalized students to directly tell us what was going on. Otherwise, we kind of lead with values neutral, so it's basically like everyone's kind of the same, when we know that that's not the case. We know that their identities have an impact. We know that their home lives have an impact. And so we just need to give them a space to provide that.
Thank you. The other question that we had was when you were talking about how various students were impacted by COVID-19 with the slide with the data. And the question was, is the resilience that is felt by Black students associated with those students having to navigate through oppression in their day-to-day lives?
Yeah, I mean, that's, again, we don't have an answer, right? But there's a lot of theories out there that say that, like, our Black students are actually more resilient in these moments than some of their other peers, or other peers who may not be on the margins. And so our belief is that they are equipped with tools to deal with difficult situations. That does not mean that they're okay, right? That does not mean that they're not facing trauma and they don't need support, but generally they have more coping mechanisms than other folks. So that's kind of why we believe that. We also heard a little bit of that in our presentation, or in our listening sessions, that our students expressed that, again, this wasn't, the pandemic itself was manageable. It was all the impacts of the pandemic that built on the things that were already really rough for them. That's kind of where we're leading on. But again, anyone wants to do that research, I'm up for it. But that's kind of where we sort of land, is that's based on our anecdotal and what students have told us. So yes.
Great, thanks, Dr. Howard. Our next question is, how do you both best navigate isolation and othering within institutions that structurally politicize keeping multi-identity professionals apart? That's a very important and loaded question, I will say, but I'll hand it over to our guest speakers to see if they can get to that.
Jimmy, go ahead.
Yeah, so community is really important, right? So building connections, having task force, having coalitions, I think, we're lucky at the University of Oregon that there are standing task force for different groups of color and other marginalized folks on campus. So there's an instant sort of like connection to other folks on campus. However, though, that doesn't mean that we're always heard. And so that can be really challenging, particularly like as a person who holds multiple marginalized identities. I am not just a member of the Black task force, and I'm not just a member of our queer task force. There's parts of me that kind of get lost in that transition. And so for us, it's about continuing, as we advocate for students, to advocate for ourselves, to say, my experience isn't a monolith. I'm not the same as this person, as this person, this person. We have the same identities. We have some cultural and some historic trauma, shared together. And there are some things that I need you to know based on my experience. And I think that one of the most challenging parts about that is that people that we're talking to want to see data, right? They want to see something that's tangible. They don't want to hear the story, right? Or the story is important, but it's not maybe going to make change. And what I would offer to that is continuing to educate yourself on reflexive practices, critical praxis, to understand that even one story can be the thing that makes us change, right? Like, we don't need to have every person on campus say that they feel ostracized and isolated. We just need one person to say that, because then we can figure out, again, if we make a change for that one person or that one professional, it's going to have a lasting impact on other folks. So again, I think we have to help our leadership and our institutions shift their mindset a little bit to say, we're not asking you to make, monumental change. We're just asking you to make small changes to make the workplace more approachable, easier for us to navigate, and also easier for us to, again, navigate our own concerns as we're also trying to help students with theirs. So Ritu, if you have anything else to add.
Yeah, two quick strategies I would say is the first one is and especially in thinking through doing intersectional work, I have prioritized my work to include having intentional engagement with different communities, which allows me to also feel personally nourished and being able to work with those staff and faculty. The other piece too, and this really goes back to the leadership of Jimmy and my direct supervisors as well, is that they have been able to model that professionalism isn't a monolith and that we should care for employees and supervisees based on what they need to show up to work. And holding that empathy and care around how we can support them in specific moments, because different things that are happening sociopolitically can impact our ability to just be at work and also be in the mind frame to support our students and colleagues. So those are my two quick tips along with that. I recognize it's 12 p.m. or for us 12 p.m. So I'll pass it back to Sana.
Yeah, and if you have to jump off, reminder again to take that survey. But if both of my guest speakers have a few more moments, there's two more questions that I'd like to address in the questions, if that's okay. And I see them both nodding. Okay. So the first one was, have you all adapted to mutual aid models of assistance and language of solidarity versus charity or giving? And so if someone wants to take that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think when we have done, and I think this might be connected to the ways in which we support our community. We think about ourselves as a network of ducks. I know that's, we're at the University of Oregon, we're ducks. And so again, we try to make sure that we don't have a deficit mindset, right? So that we're not believing that students are coming to us with a deficit or something is wrong with them and that we need to come in and save them, right? Students would do just fine, right? They would find their resources. They might struggle a little bit more without us. But again, our job is to really to bring them in and again, not believe that they are in a deficit, but think of what we can add to their experience, right? What is the debt that we owe the students? So again, we think about ourselves as a community by which we are all supporting each other. We come to each other as imperfect beings, right? I come to a student with like expertise, but I'm not an expert on their life, right? And so I'm learning in the moment about what they're thinking about and how they're experiencing. I'm learning just as much about their experience as they are getting the resources and support from me. So again, this is a mutual exchange. This is collaborative. And so again, we try to, again, reduce the stigma that, even as we're thinking about our campaigns for our crisis fund, we try to reduce that you're not just giving money, you're actually contributing to a community. And we also ask, if we give students money for emergency purposes, we ask them to give back later. When you have the ability to give back, right? We try to make sure that folks realize they're part of a community that's here to provide mutual support. And again, we can't exist as practitioners without our students, and we learn and we grow through the experiences that they're having, that we learn about, and then we change our practices, right? We change the way we think about things. And that, I think, is part of our framework and how we think about, again, and I think this is kind of the point of the question, when we think about the collaboration, the mutual exchange that's happening on campus. And again, we don't think about our students as charity. We don't think about our students as like, we're giving something, we're saving you. You're helping us be better in our practice through coming to us and giving support. So.
And two quick things, or actually a couple of quick things I'll add. There is, today we really focus on the response side and crisis intervention. In the work I do on the prevention side, similar values that we are very student directed. And I really appreciate that we are well resourced enough to compensate our students accordingly, especially when they're doing the work of engaging in peer education and support around these issues of sexualized violence, substance misuse and abuse, emotional distress, and thoughts of suicide or suicide as a whole. And so a part of that, when I think about mutual aid and empowerment-based language of solidarity, and this again goes back to things I've included, is how we are visibly communicating that and modeling that for anyone coming in, our colleagues and students, but then integrating that into what we do as programming. And so that goes back to we are student-led. The choices we make are both assessed based off of, and especially in the work of sexualized violence, promising practices, but then also making sure to what Jimmy said, we are qualitatively assessing what our students need on our campus, because there are unique needs that show up for some of the pieces of being a predominantly white institution in the state of Oregon that has a very unique history around anti-Blackness and colonial violence, as well as us being an institution that very often is ranked highly in the Campus Pride Index, among a couple things. And so I would just add that very quickly for now. And I think Jimmy and I can say that every single question can be a 1-hour conversation on its own. So just know that these are quick pieces, but there's so much more we can add to this. And Sana, did you say there was one more question, or we get time?
I think we addressed all of the questions, unless you all see anything that popped up. I just got a question to my personal chat about, could you all elaborate on racial battle fatigue and how that can be triggering and traumatic for practitioners while working with students of color? That's a tough question. Unfortunately, we won't be able to take any more after that. But if you have any, I'll again share the presenter's contact information, or you could always email me as well.
And I can start with this, and Jimmy, please feel free to add. So in the slides, there is that definition of what racial battle fatigue is. And then going back to the end of boundaries and balance around being in the workplace, I do have some notes around directly addressing and validating your experiences, right? Because sometimes we actually don't realize, and this has happened for me early on in my career, that what I was experiencing was related to microaggressions and macroaggressions in the workplace, related to my specific identities of being part of the South Asian community that Sana and I have definitely talked through on our own and bonded over. And so a part of that is where I started adding in what are those unique experiences specifically around racial battle fatigue, and naming it, as well as then responding to it with some tips and prompts. If we have the time, I can quickly go back and name some of these, or in the interest of time, you will have these presentation slides. And then I'll pass it on to Jimmy to add some things if you want.
No, I think you did a really good job. I think it's recognizing the fact that folks of color have an incredibly high tax on campus. Again, this is why the slide that Ritu shared about figuring out who comes to you is really important, because we need to be asking our other colleagues the same question. Who's coming to you and for what and why? And again, in this day and age, it is not okay for you to say, I don't know how to help folks of color. I don't know how to support this group. And again, while students might feel more comfortable coming to folks who look like them, anyone can help. And we need to share in that experience. And so again, Ritu and I both share the fact that, we work at a PWI, on a campus that has mostly, we're in the minority in terms of employees. And so we definitely feel sort of the struggle to continue to fight for what's right. But also, we also challenge our peers to join us in that we can't hold that on our own. And I think that's my biggest piece of advice, is to make sure that you're always engaging others who identify as a majority to join us on the cause. And that, again, it's making your work that is generally invisible very visible to them. I think that sometimes helps them understand the work that that's placed on us based on our location in the institution and our social identities. So I think that's it.
Yeah, and I will say that finally, just one quick thing. I know I'm not a guest speaker, but I'm just going to throw something in there that for me, it has been leaning on my community and practicing in collective community care. And so, when you have that colleague who lends you their shoulder to cry on, that you are also there for your colleagues, for your students, for the community. I have found that even in moments of collective trauma, I have found collective healing and solidarity in being able to hold hands. And hugging is not happening right now, but virtual hugs and love and comfort and care can go a long way. Checking in authentically and really showing up for your community can really assist in collective healing and in processing trauma collectively. So with that, that's a really great kind of transition, because we have a whole self-care webinar series for our practitioners called It's Okay to Not Be Okay. We know that you're tired, you're overwhelmed, you're exhausted. So we'll be doing a number of webinars and this fall term, especially for you. I sent the link in the chat, so check it out. But with that, we'll wrap it up. Our apologies for running a few minutes over time. We appreciate you staying here. Again, continued best wishes and positive vibes for your family, your community, your loved ones, your campus communities, your students. If we at Project Success can assist you in any number of campaigns, whether text messages, call campaigns, thinking about your upcoming registration cycle, we're here to support you on that. Please feel free to reach out to me or your institutional support consultant. But I wish you well. Take care, and I hope to see you at one of our future webinars. And thank you again to our guest speakers. This would not have been possible without you two. I really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy days and with so much happening in your community to spend some time with us. We really appreciate you. Okay, take care, all. Have a great day.